Saad is, oh, thank you. Yes, we were recording. Saad is a technologist with the Palantir platform, and he's phenomenal at Q&A and understanding a whole lot of what N3C does, as well as the Enclave. With that said, I'll turn it over to Saad, and feel free to use the Q&A. We'll be hanging around answering questions, and we do hope to distribute the slides to you guys at some point. Somebody mentioned in the chat. So thank you. Take it away, Saad.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for the introduction. Let me reshare my screen. Awesome. Yeah, so this is the second session of the N3C Orientation. And so in terms of content, or first in terms of scope, it's recommended that you've attended session A, but not necessarily needed. We're gonna review some of the stuff we discussed last time. The audience is basically anyone who registered to N3C and have an account created. So it's either whether you're a new user, a new N3C user, or you already have some exposure to the Enclave. This session is for you. And this is going to be a practical session. So we're going to cover some of the tools and data analysis tools within the Enclave. It's not going to be an in-depth session, mostly covering the tools available and how to use them. And we're going to provide some additional resources for people to get more information. So this is roughly the outline. So first, some refreshers from session A. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project folder structure, the data catalog, how to look for data, look at the available tools and apps within the Enclave. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept set tools available and how to use them to perform data analysis. So that includes concept set browser, contour reports, the editor, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Code Workbook, which is one of the code-based tools to perform data analysis and write code, with some other tools that I'll cover afterwards. So let me switch to the Enclave. Can you guys see my screen? So this is the starting point when you log into the Enclave. So quick navigation in here. You have some key statistics about the data available in the Enclave and some useful tabs in here. So the data tab, for example, describes how to request access to data, among other things, by submitting a data use request. So it describes the process to do that. We talked a little bit about it in session A. The training tab has some documentation to get you up to speed in the Enclave. So whether it's N3C specific or specific to the tools and apps within the Enclave. So there are self-guided tours, more in-depth documentation, and some resources for troubleshooting. And then the Discover tab is where we're making available some of the useful apps and interfaces that you might need to perform analysis. So that's for the homepage. You have a sidebar in here for people who haven't used the Enclave before. And in this sidebar, when you expand it, in the upper section, you see a link to the homepage. And then you see a link to projects and files. That takes you to the existing research projects folders and existing data sets within the Enclave. So you can see a bunch of research project folders in here. You can look for a specific research project by, you can type in the search by keyword and look for a specific research project. And then if you don't know the location of a specific, of any data set, you can also use the search bar in here. So let's say I'm not sure about the location of one of the domain tables called visit occurrence. I can just type it in here, and then it will give me the matching resources, and I can jump into the table in here from the search bar. So it's also useful functionality to kind of navigate around. The app section in here shows the some of the analysis tools available within the Enclave. So we're gonna talk more about Contour, Code Workbook, and reports today. A little bit about Fusion. There are more, if you click view all, there are more tools and apps available. These are some of the most commonly used. And then at the bottom here is basically all the resources that you added as favorites, so you can have quick access to them in here. And then last but not least for the navigation is this help and support section in here. So it takes you to a few resources. Academy are basically some self-guided tutorials. Documentation is more in-depth documentation about the tools available. And then if you have an issue, you can click on report issue and ask a question to the support team, or whether it's a question about the data, a question about how to use a specific tool or app, or a question about a bug or a build error. You can basically file in an issue here, and it will help us basically triage it and get back to you to your questions. So that's about the orientation. Now, if in projects and files, there is the data catalog in here, and the data catalog is basically a collection of useful data sets and other resources. So one of the most useful collections in here, for example, if you have access to the identified data, this project is like the domain tables and most useful shared data sets for the identified data. There is an LDS data folder as well. We're going to be using today a SynPuf synthetic data, which is learning data similar in schema to the de-identified and LDS. And there is a dashboards and apps collection, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So let's look at the synthetic data folder in here. You can see here a bunch of domain tables. And let's open, for example, one of the tables here called procedure occurrence, which, as the name suggests, has information about the procedures. When you open it, you have a preview of the data set or a table. I use the term data set and table interchangeably, but it's basically a preview of rows and columns of this procedure occurrence data set. And here on the left panel, you have some metadata and information about the data set. So you could see it has 19 columns, about 14 million rows. You can see when it was updated and when it was created and by who. It gives you the location of the data set within the Enclave. And you can also see here the input data sets that basically were used to create this data set that you see in here. So procedure occurrence data set and concept data set were the inputs to create this data that you're seeing here. You can look at the list of the existing columns in here, or you can basically scroll search here, or like use this search bar here to look for specific columns. So we can, for example, if I type in name, it will filter to only the columns that have name in the column name. And if I click, for example, on one of the columns, it will give me some quick statistics about this column in particular. So this one is procedure type concept name. And you can see here you have outpatient header, inpatient header, and you can use this to narrow down to some records of interest and continue your exploration. So now I clicked on only inpatient header, and these are the records I'm seeing here. And then I can remove back the filter to get back to my initial view. So now that we have seen an example of these domain tables, the question is, how do we filter the conditions to say the conditions or measurements or procedures or medications of interest in order to define a cohort to study? So this is where I'm going to talk about concept sets, and this is where concept sets can be useful. So what is a concept set? Basically, a concept set is a collection of codes, also referred to as concept IDs, from OMOP vocabularies that are used to define phenotypes. So examples of this could be, let's say, a set of conditions to define, a set of condition codes to define chronic kidney disease, or a set of codes that correspond to lab tests for white blood cell count or for COVID positive results. So a number of these concept sets have been defined in the Enclave by researchers and other users, and these can be reused or refined. Some are still ongoing review process. And to find these concept sets, we're gonna go back to the homepage and the Discover tab, and there's a useful tool called Concept Set Browser. So this concept set browser is an interface that lets you explore existing concept sets in the Enclave. So you can look at the list of all the concept sets in here, and then you can pick one of interest that maybe you might want to use in your analysis. You can filter by status or stage, or by the person who created this concept set or the persons assigned to review it. So for the sake of example, I'm gonna look at any concept set that has the keyword PCR defined in it. And if I look into that, I have two results. And this one in particular, Atlas SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR and AG, looks like a definition of the PCR positive results as well as antibody tests. So let's click on it to visualize it. So when we open it, we see that there are two versions that has been created by these two people. Let's look at the second and latest version, for example. So when I open it, I see some metadata that describes this concept set. So it's uniquely identified by this identifier called CodeSet ID. This is the name of it. And when we can see when it was created and by who. And if we scroll down, we can see a few things that, for example, this concept set has been used in these three different projects: cohort characterization, orthopedic surgery, and it has been used to define these three different cohorts. So Atlas lab positive, lab test lab confirmed positive. This one looks like a PCR and antibody cohort. And if we scroll up and if we look at this tab, OMOP concepts, you can see the 55 different concepts that are included in this concept sets. So these are all, most of them are from the low-ink vocabulary. Some are from SNOMED. And these are all measurements. So we can see there are 55 measurement concepts. And if we click on any one of them, we can get more information. So this concept is a lab test or a measurement. This is the name of it, and it's from the low-ink vocabulary. So now that we've kind of explored the concept sets browser, how do we use that in practice? How do we like narrow down to a specific concept set and use it in the analysis, in an analysis? The way to do that is, let's go back to the data catalog. So if we go to project and file and go to data catalog, there's this collection called OMOP code sets, and it has this data set called concept set member. And this is the data set that is back in the view that I was showing you on the concept set editor. So let's wait for it to load. So this table is essentially a mapping between concept sets or code sets defined by their code set ID and their name, and the corresponding concepts that they contain defined by their concept ID or their concept name. So let's say I want to select a concept set of interests from this table. and use the concepts it contains to extract records of interest from a domain table. In order to do that, I'm gonna click on Analyze. And this is gonna take me to this tool called Contour, which you can also access to from this left panel in here. So let's minimize the panel. This tool is basically a point and click tool for data analysis. So it's non-code based, and it lets you start with your data set, in this case, concept set member, and apply a series of either visualizations or transformations to analyze your data. So for example, to start, I'm gonna just use a table board to visualize, to have a preview of my data. So as you can see, this is the data set, concept set members that we were looking at in the other preview. Now let's look at a histogram of the concept let's look at a histogram of the code set IDs. So as you can see, the starting point is a data set of 1.6 million rows and 6 columns. Looking at this histogram, I see that some of the IDs, some of the concept sets have multiple concepts in them. So for example, this one has 43,000 concepts in it. Yeah, and you can basically explore the breakdown and the distribution of this concept set in here. Now, let's say I want to filter to a concept set that that contains that is related to pneumonia. I'm going to use a filter board. And I just want to keep the concepts that contain the name pneumonia in them. And so now if I look at a summary of my filtered results, and I can see that I filtered down to about 20,000 rows. And I can look at a histogram of the concept names that I selected. So as you can see here, a bunch of concepts related to pneumonia in them. The problem with this approach of matching by string, matching the concept name or looking for it by matching to a specific string is that it can be non-accurate. You might miss some of the concepts or include ones that you don't want. So a good practice is, instead of filtering by concept name, I'm gonna filter by the specific code set ID that I wanna focus on. So for that, let's go back to the concept set browser for a moment. And let me look for the concept names that are associated with pneumonia condition. As you can see, there are a bunch of them. For the sake of example, I'm gonna pick this one, non-influenza pneumonia. And there has been only one version of it. And so I'm gonna grab this unique identifier, the code set ID, and this one has 221 concepts in it. So I'm gonna grab this concept ID and go back to my analysis and filter by the specific code set ID. So if I pass it in here, my results at the bottom here downstream will update. And as expected, we get 221 rows, which are corresponding to our 221 concepts that I mentioned in this view. And while it's loading, now that I narrowed to the list of concepts that define non-influenza pneumonia, let's say we would like to get, and as you can see here, this is a breakdown of all the concepts that correspond to this code set ID. And as you can see, they are unique. Now, let's say we would like to get the corresponding patient records from a domain table. Since non-influenza pneumonia is a condition, we're going to grab the condition occurrence table from the synthetic data collection. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a join board. And I would like to join with the condition occurrence table, which I am going to select from the data catalog. So if we go back to data catalog, and in my case, I'm using the synthetic data collection. And let's grab the condition occurrence table. And I'm going to add all the columns from this table. And if we open quickly the condition occurrence table, before performing the join, we can see here, if I filter down by condition, there is a column called condition concept ID. And this is basically what we want to join or to match with our set of concepts that we defined. So the matching condition is going to be concept ID matching this column called condition concept ID. And since what we want here is an inner join or an intersection to only keep the condition occurrence records that tightly match this list of concepts that we've defined above. So I'm going to save that. And if we click calculate summary, we're going to get a number of records from the condition table, from the condition occurrence table that I can visualize again using a table board. While this is loading, this is the analysis. The analysis I created, I can give it a name and save it in a specific folder so that I can refer to it in the future or reuse it. So let's call it N3C Orientation Analysis. And let's save it in, I have a folder that I created called N3C Orientation. Obviously for researchers, each one will have their respective research projects in which they can save resources. So I'm calling it N3C Orientation Analysis, and I'm saving it into this folder. And so now with the intersection, I started from a condition occurrence table, which has 14 million rows, 14.8 million rows. And I'm getting to 31,000 records corresponding to the concept set that I've been using, the non-influenza pneumonia. So I'm going to go a little bit faster on this step just to show the existing functionality of Contour. And some examples are basically, let's say I want to create a new column. I see here that I have two columns, a condition start date and a condition end date. And let's say I'm interested in defining a column called the duration, a condition duration. what I'm gonna do here is there's something called an expression board, which lets you use some expressions using SQL-like syntax and define new columns or edit existing columns. So let's define a new column called condition duration. And there's a function that is called dateDiff, which you can look at the documentation in here and see what it does. And I'm gonna use it with condition start. So the arguments are condition start date and condition end date. And it's going to return the number of days between these two dates. So if I look at the table board again.
So Saad, there's a question in chat about the capability of Contour to generate SQL. Is there a way to export a code version of what's happening in your Contour?
That is a good question. Not to export, so you can't export a code version of it. However, what you can do is define, there is a library of function that you can also contribute to and define using this expression, and it can be used by other people in different contour analysis. And I'm gonna talk about the SQL code in Code Workbook in a bit when we talk about Code Workbooks. I hope that answers the question. We can talk in the Q&A if there's further questions about it. So as you can see here, I defined the column called condition duration. And let's say this is a data set that I'm happy with. It has 31,000 rows. I want to use it in different analysis, or I want to show it to my colleagues. Now that I've arrived to this result, I can save it. And let me call it, let me go again to my N3C Orientation folder. And I'm gonna call it non-influenza pneumonia conditions example. So while it's building, let's look at some other functionality. And let's say I want to create a report that summarizes my results so that I'm able to show my results to other people, to maybe my research project coworkers. So let's start by creating some visuals. The first one I can create here is, for the sake of example, I'm gonna use define a grid. And I'm gonna show in the x-axis concept names, in the y-axis the duration of columns that I created. And what I wanna show in this grid is maybe a unique count of patients. So this is the grid it generated. You can see here condition occurrence in the y-axis, condition concept name, and when you hover over the grid, you can see the number of people. Let's say this is a visualization that I want to show in a report. I can click Add to Reports and create a new report. And let us save it in the N3C Orientation folder. Let's call it non-influenza pneumonia conditions report. So now it's going to add this visual into this report that you can see here. Let's open it quickly to have and to like kind of see what it looks like. So as you can see here, this is a report that I started creating. I can start writing some text here. This is my report, and format it a little bit. And we're going to go back to it in a second, but this report is, as you can see here, saved in the N3C Orientation folder, and other people can look at it within the research projects, can look at it. So now, as you can see here, the data set output updated. Let me create another visual, and let's say I'm interested into the demographics, which are in the person table. The person table is also one of the domain tables in the data catalog. So let me create a separate path so that I can organize my analysis. And this path is gonna start from the results of my existing path. And let's call it demographics analysis. And what I wanna do is add information, for example, about gender from the person table. So first I need to bring in the person table with the join statement. So select dataset. Let's go again to the synthetic data folder and grab the person table. And let's say I only want to grab the gender from it. And the matching condition is going to be here on the person. So every person in this table that I created, I'm going to look up their gender from this table. So, and this is going to be a add columns or a left join. So I don't want to do an intersection, but just grab the relevant genders. And so now that I did that, what I can do is let's add another visual for the report. And in this visual, we're going to look again at the conditions in the y-axis. And we're going to look at a unique count of the persons, but segmenting by the gender that we just grabbed from the person table. So let's look at that. Let's actually show it in separate bars. So right now we have another visual, which is a breakdown by gender. We're still showing the count of persons, and let's add that to the reports that we just created, non-influenza pneumonia condition. And now that it's been added, I can go back to my reports and you can see the results in here. We can also format it, add some titles to our visuals. And when I'm done formatting the reports, I can switch to view mode. And this is basically my presentation mode. Yeah, so that's on the report section. One thing to note is when the underlying data updates, this is an interactive report. So the visuals will update when the underlying data updates. And there's also the ability to create parameters that you can play with in this report to show the visuals parameterized depending on your input parameters. Now that I've showed some of the ways to use the concept sets that are defined in the Enclave, I wanted to mention one additional tool before talking about Code Workbook. If we go back to the data catalog and look at the dashboards and apps, we've covered the concept sets browser, which lets you explore existing concept sets. But let's say you're interested in starting with an existing concept set, but refining it either by adding new concepts to it or removing new concepts or creating new versions of concept sets. This is where the concept set editor comes into play. And so we're gonna, let me go quickly through an example. So I'm going to pass this concept set name in here and load my concept set into this editor. And you have a bunch of information in here, such as the included concepts and the list of concept IDs. So one example, what I can do is maybe remove this specific concept ID from it. And then there is a section here in which I can add new concepts to it. So if I search, for example, by pneumonia, and just randomly add this specific concept to my concept set. So I just added it in here. And this is a way to edit an existing one and then create a new version. So my update message is going to be new version of pneumonia concept set. And I can update, and this will effectively create a new version of this concept set that I can reuse from my analysis. So this was a quick overview. Obviously, I didn't cover all the functionality, but I wanted to mention the existence of this tool. And there's some documentation for it. So the last thing I want to say about the concept set tools is the documentation. So going back to the home page, if I go to this cover, if I go to the training and go to the training portal, the training portal is some documentation that is specific to N3C tools or the Enclave tools. Most of it is in this N3C modules. And I just wanted to mention something useful, which is this documentation about concept set tools. So this is a tutorial that you can follow, and it has all the information about how to upload or create a concept set, either using, for example, the Atlas tool, and then how to use the concept set editor, as well as the SOP for creation and review and validation of new concept sets. So I wanted to mention the existence of this tutorial for people, if people want more information and want to dig further. Sean and Richard, should I pause for questions here, or I can jump to the to talk about Code Workbook?
I think you should keep going to the Code Workbooks. At least one of the questions is going to be answered in that section. And we're doing a good job, I think, clearing out the Q&A. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Let me go back to my folder N3C Orientation. And so this is going to be quicker, but I want to show you how to do a similar workflow using the tool called Code Workbook, which is basically a code-based tool. So for people who want to write code and maybe do more advanced data processing, we can use Code Workbook. So in my folder, I'm going to click on New and create a new Code Workbook. And let's give it a name, N3C Orientation Code Workbook example. And so think of this as kind of similar to Jupyter Notebook, but interacting with the resources within the Enclave. So now that I've opened this Code Workbook, what I can do is import datasets into this workbook. And so let me import the concept set member table that I've used with my contour analysis in the analysis I showed today. So if I go to OMOP concept sets, I'm going to import my concept set member table. And as you can see here, it loaded it on a graph here as a node. And let me also import the condition occurrence table that I've worked with. So now I have two data sets in my workbook, which I can play with. If I click on each one of them, it gives me a preview of the data. So this is a preview of the data set.
I can open it from here and get like a preview and explore it from the dataset preview UI. And so from here, I can start writing code. And before starting to do that, just a quick orientation. Or maybe let me start writing code first. So if I click on new from here or from this node or from a new transformation, it basically asks me to pick the language of that I want to write my transformation with. So you have R, Python available. You can write SQL code. And I'll talk about templates in a bit. But let me pick, in this example, R code. And so the way it works is basically what you have here in this editor that I can expand is a function, an R function in this case. And so it takes as input my data set, in this case, condition occurrence, and the output has to be a data frame that can be saved as a Foundry dataset, as an Enclave dataset. So let me also add the concept set members input, and I can add it multiple ways. I can click on add inputs in here and click on it, and it will add my concept set members input, or I can simply just write the name of my dataset, concept set members, and it will automatically recognize it and draw a line. So right now, this is my output dataset, and it's using these two datasets as input. And now let's name our output selected pneumonia conditions. And I'm gonna do a similar operation as the one I showed with contour. And just to go faster, I have this code saved. I've written this code already, so I'm just gonna paste it in this editor. But this is basically our code, where I'm basically specifying my code set ID. In this case, this is the one corresponding to the non-influenza pneumonia. And I'm taking these two variables that corresponding to my inputs, and then filtering down my concept set member table to this specific code set ID before performing the join with the concept set members table. And so this is gonna, if I click on preview, it will run and return the results of this transformation. And one thing to note while it's running, this is Spark R syntax. So Spark R is a library in R that lets you interact with Spark. So the Enclave runs on this distributed environment called Spark, which makes processing large data more efficient. So you can choose to write R code or using Spark R syntax using this library, or you can choose to use native R. So in order to do that, you can, as an input, you can basically pick whether you want a native R data frame or a Spark data frame. And this will let you basically write with the library of your choice. So while it might be easier to use native R, there are some advantages of using the Spark R library, specifically when we work with large data sets. When we work with large data sets and we start hitting some slowness or some space limitations, then Spark is definitely very useful to process large amounts of data. And we can say similar things about Python. So in Python, you can use, for example, pandas, that library, to manipulate data frame. But it's also recommended when the data set is large to use Spark library within Python to process large amounts of data. And while it's running, for people who are not familiar with Spark, in the help and support, if you go to the documentation, there is a Spark cheat sheet that gives you the most common functions. In the Spark library. So let's wait for it to run. And so while it's running, something I wanted to show as well is basically how to define our concepts sets in a more and maintain them in a more elegant way, which doesn't require having them on the code here. And it makes it easier to maintain a list of concept sets and change them without having to change the code. So for that, I'm going to introduce a tool called Fusion. And let me open it from my working folder. And Fusion is essentially it's basically a spreadsheet within the Enclave that interacts with other tools of the Enclave. And what I may want to do is maintain a list of code set IDs that are useful for my research projects and that I refer to very often. And as an example, I'm gonna create a mapping here of 2 concept IDs that I may want to be using frequently in my research projects. And I don't want to be writing them in the code and maintaining them every time. So I'm defining them in this, if you will, configuration file. And I'm going to sync this spreadsheet into a data set so I can import it in my code workbook and work with it. So for that, I'm going to just select my table and then sync it to a data set. And let's call this data set my input concept sets. And so what this is going to do is it's going to create a data set that has this information in it. Now, if I go back to, let's call this Fusion sheet concept set mapping. And if I go back to my N3C orientation folder, I've just defined this data set, which corresponds to this data set is basically the result of my Fusion sheets. And it's going to take a few seconds to load, but essentially it will contain the information that I defined on the Fusion sheet. And I can call it from this workbook. So let's give it a few seconds. And so when running this data set, when I click on the preview, it basically just runs my code on a subset of the input data. If I want to actually write the results of my transformation on a new data set, I can click Save as Data Set in here. And so let me call my output data set select pneumonia and run the code again. And so what this is going to do is it's going to write the results of my code into this data set select pneumonia that I can use later. And while this is running, let's check on our mapping data set. And as you can see here, I see my defined code set IDs. Let me also rename this concept set input. And let me import it into this workbook. So I'm gonna go to import dataset again. And from my N3C orientation folder, select this concept set input in here. And that's another way to basically, instead of writing the concept code set ID in the code, I'm gonna use this mapping to do my filtering. So let me create a new transformation for that. And let me this time just to change select Python code. So I have my concept set inputs, and I have, let me add my condition occurrence table. And let me also add my concept set members table, because that's the table that is going to give me the concept IDs. And let's call this selected conditions. So that's the output of my my transformation, and I'm going to save it as a data set and call it also selected conditions. So this is the variable name, selected condition, that you can call from the code. And this is the name of the corresponding data set. So the way it works is similar. You're starting with a data frames as inputs, and then you're basically writing a Python function. So just for the sake of example, I'm just gonna pick this data frame concept set inputs, and I'm gonna return this data frame. And for the sake of time, I'm not gonna spend time writing this code, but just wanted to show some functionality. One of the functionalities that is useful is you may wanna import some of the useful Python or R libraries into your code so that you can use them. And the way to do that is you can either write import here as a statement. So one of the useful libraries is called PySpark SQL functions. Or let's do from PySpark SQL call functions and rename it F. So now you can call all the functions in this library using the keyword f dot in this code. What you can also do is if I import my library into this code editor that is used to generate this table select condition, if I have a different node, and this is not the best example because it's R, but let's say if I have a Python code in a different node, I won't be able to use that library in here because unless I specifically also import it in here. So in order to remediate to that, what I can do is instead of importing my my functions or my library into this node, I'm gonna import it in the global code. So there is a Python and an R global code. And this is basically just an editor in which you can write down all the imports or all the functions that you want to use in every transformation in this workbook. And so the last thing I wanted to mention before talking about templates and the knowledge store is this console. Just for orientation, there is a console in here on your right. And the console is basically if you want to execute some just standalone standalone function count, standalone like code snippets. So I can, for example, just explore my data set concept set members and run the results in here, or I want to check the syntax of my code, I can do it into this console. The other thing that might be useful is this content panel. So as your workbook become complex and you import multiple data sets in it and you have multiple transformations, this is an easier way to navigate in your transformations and look into them and jump between different transformations or different data sets into this workbook. So that is for the content section. And then the last thing I can show is in this code workbook, let's say you've created a logic, and this code logic is something that might be reused or that you want it to be reused by other colleagues or researchers within your project. You may want to templatize it so that other people can reuse it without having to rewrite the code. And so in order to do that, what I can do here from this code editor, I can create a template. And let's call this template, let's create a template that basically takes the concept set members table, the condition occurrence table, and some concept ID, not necessarily this one, and then returns the results. So let's call it example filter to specific condition given code set ID. And so what I want to do here is make this line a parameter. And so I can click on add new parameter in here, and let's call it concept set ID input. And if I highlight it on the code here, it automatically replaces it with the variable name. And this is a default value for it, but that's the variable name that represents my code set ID. What I can do as well is make these parameters, the concept set member table. Let's say I always want to use this table. So I don't want to make this as a selectable or a changeable parameter. I can click on this box. So it's going to always use the concept set members table. And let me do the same thing for condition occurrence table. So once I do that, now my template has 3 parameters. This is the one that users can input. And let me create this template. And let me choose to save as a data set. So when you run the template, it will save the output as a data set. So I'm going to create this template, which is another resource that I'm going to put in my N3C orientation folder. So now I saved this template in my folder. And in order to use it, or let's say if I'm a different user and I want to use the template that was just created, let me create a new codebook. Let's call it code workbook second user. Now, what I want to do is use the template that was just created instead of rewriting the code myself. So by clicking on new transformation, instead of picking R, Python, or SQL code, and I'm going to browse for the existing templates. And the one I just created, if I don't know where it lives, I can look for in the search bar in here. And as you can see, it already, I have the results in here, and that's the template I want to use. I can make it as a favorite, so it shows up in my favorites bar. And if I select this template, it automatically imports the inputs, condition occurrence, and concept set members table. And instead of having code here, I just have basically an interface in which I can basically input enter my inputs. So for example, I can enter the other concept ID that I created in my Fusion sheet. Let me grab it. The one corresponding to cancer condition. Oops, sorry. So going back here, I can enter this concept and click on run, and it will take a few seconds, maybe a couple minutes to run the transformation, depending on the complexity of the transformation and the size of the data. And the output is going to be saved in this data set called new data set that I can rename to something like cancer conditions example. And having this output here, when it finishes running, I will see the preview in here of the results. If I have any logs that I'm printing, or if I have errors, they will be on the logs section in here. If I have some visualizations that I'm plotting, either by using some of the common libraries like matplotlib for Python or ggplot for R, you would be able to see the visualizations in here. So while this is running, something I can show quickly, which might be useful for people who want to get started with the Code Workbook, is that we've put together an example workbook, and we're working on adding more. But if I look for, there's a project which is accessible by everyone called Examples Project. And right now it only has one workbook example, one code workbook example, but we're working on adding more. And in here, you can see just some basic examples of using R and Python within Code Workbook to manipulate data and either create new table outputs or create some visualizations in here that you can look at. So just code examples that you can get inspired from and borrow code from here. It has examples both using native R and Spark R, and also using PySpark and Pandas. So feel free to poke around. And then the last thing I want to mention is, now that I've gave a brief overview of Code Workbook, is basically the knowledge store. So a number of these templates, you may want to democratize them and have them used by other researchers within the N3C community, especially if they're very common or that they may be of interest. So for that, we have the knowledge store, which is basically a collection of templates and what we call knowledge objects that other people can reuse. So that's in the homepage on the Discover section. There's a knowledge store app. And what you see here on the left panel is a bunch of what we call knowledge objects that has been published by people, users within N3C, and can be used by, can be reused by the community. So some of them are Code Workbook templates. So if you click on, for example, I just clicked randomly on this one, cohort labs and medication analysis, you have a description of what this template does. Here is a nice visual on how to use it, and some metadata. And this is basically the link for the shared logic. So this is basically the Code Workbook template that you can import in your Code Workbook and use it. If I click on it, it basically just gives me a description of, this is a more complex template, so it has multiple nodes. But basically, it's a description of all the templates available. Knowledge objects can be Code Workbook templates, but they could also be just data sets that are shared or that are shareable, or documentation. One of the useful ones, I think, is Atlas Cohort JSON to dataset, which is basically helps define a set of COVID positive patients. This is the template, and I think there is this one, ATG test lab confirmed positive, is basically a documentation that is a tutorial on how to define COVID positive patients, defined by things like PCR positive tests or antibody tests. We have the description of the inclusion criteria here and a description on how to use this cohort, whether you have access to LDS or Safe Harbor. So this is the type of shareable logic that you can find in this knowledge store and you can reuse within your respective projects. We also have documentation on how to contribute to the knowledge store once we have a logic or a data set or some documentation that you want to publish. So feel free to reach out to us and we'll guide you through the process of publishing to the knowledge store. So that's on the knowledge store. The last resource I wanted to mention without expanding on it, because I know we've kind of running out of time, is the Phenotype Explorer. So the Phenotype Explorer is a tool that lets you explore some and visualize statistics about a given OMAP phenotype. So for example, the diabetes phenotype, you can see like the statistics about the data that exists within the enclave. And you can also compare with the phenotype that has been used on the cohort paper, basically. So that's a distribution of sex, race, and ethnicity within the cohort, and this is a comorbidity distribution. So this is a good starting point to maybe explore the existing phenotypes and see what data we have in the enclave, and then start using the phenotype within Code Workbooks. So there is in the knowledge store, there is a knowledge object that explains how to use any one of these phenotypes in your Code Workbook to define your cohort. Yeah, so just to wrap it up, I know I went fast in the last part of this presentation, but I wanted to just give a reminder of the existing resources for people to get more information. So there's the training portal, which is in the Enclave homepage, which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. This has documentation specific about N3C tool. It also has a link to Academy tutorials. And if I go back real quickly here, you can also get to Academy tutorials from this help and support. And the tutorials are basically some short tutorials to guide you through existing tools within the Enclave. So how to navigate the Enclave, how to use Code Workbook, how to use some tools such as Contour. So feel free to poke around. And then there is the platform documentation, which is a more in-depth documentation about the tools. So this you can find also in help and support. If you click on documentation, if you want a more in-depth documentation about Code Workbook, you can click on it in here. And it gives you some tutorials, the concepts used and how to use Code Workbook. It has a reference, some like references on using PySpark syntax for people who want to use Python. Yeah, and then if you have an issue or a problem or a question, feel free to file an issue. Again, from help and support, you can report an issue, either ask a question or report a bug or ask a question about the tool or the data. You can stop by office hours every Tuesdays and Thursdays. You can reach out to domain teams. We'll make sure to, I guess, pass these links in the chat so you can have them. So this is the resource to get in touch with the domain teams. And if you want a more in-depth information about OMAP and the Odyssey tools, these are some of the useful resources to get up to speed with the data model that is used within the Enclave. So I'm going to stop here and pause for questions. Sean and Richard, how are we doing on the questions?
I think we're doing pretty good. We've been able to clear a lot of them out. There was one that I see that Richard is answering live right now in text, but I was curious as well. Is it possible to utilize the Phenotype Explorer results in a code workbook or other tools?
So all of the phenotypes are built from concept sets, and concept sets are universally available. So every concept set I've ever made is available to everyone else who's in N3C. Even if they don't have data access yet, you can always reuse someone else's concept sets.
Yeah, so just an example, Richard, to build on what you said on how to use a cohort in Code Workbook. If you have access to LDS, this is a useful template to define your cohort. And you can use it and select your phenotype as an example. So let me import this. This is a lot of nodes, but essentially, this lets you define, you can, the cohorts that we, the phenotypes that we saw in the Phenotype Explorer in here, I have access to them in here. And let's say I want to use the lab positive cohorts. And I can run a preview. And this is, when it's done, it will define my cohort in Code Workbook. So there is a way to basically use the phenotypes in here. This is one of the ways to like use them in your Code Workbook. Cool. Any other question?
Pneumonia duration by gender in native R. So let's see. Someone asked, could we do an example of how you would look at pneumonia duration by gender? So the first question there is, how do you get duration of pneumonia? And that data is actually a little bit sparse and maybe unreliable to identify the start and end of a particular condition. Different data models and different sites will report that more accurately. So we generally don't encourage identifying the precise duration of a particular condition, such as pneumonia. But you could look at like length of stay, like the starts and end dates of the encounters. But it's kind of hard to determine just from the condition concepts where pneumonia started and stopped. But gender information would be in the person table. So if you took Saad's data set from where he pulled out all of the pneumonia instances, you could do a join with the person table, and then that would get your gender attached into pneumonia. And then maybe you could look at age as well. So maybe instead you could look at the age distribution of all the pneumonia patients by gender. So that would be a single join to the person table, and then you could collect it and ggplot it to your heart's content in R. Do we have a template for random forest? I don't think the random forest is in the knowledge store yet, Saad.
Not yet, but we're working actively on an example for that. It should be available soon. And yeah, you can, in this code workbook, you can use libraries like scikit-learn or other machine learning libraries and import in here and run, let's say, classification models in here, just like you would write a normal Python code in a Jupyter notebook or an R code in, say, RStudio.
So someone has asked if we can put today's code workbook in the knowledge store. I think the example code workbook is in a training folder, actually. So you don't need to grab it from the knowledge store. You can go check it out in that folder. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's in the example project folder. We can add it to the knowledge store. We're gonna have to add some more description and documentation to it, but we can definitely add it to the knowledge store as well.
Can you just show how to navigate to that folder?
Yes, of course. Let me do that. Let me reshare my screen. So again, all the folders, you go to project and files. And this one is called example project. You can mark it as favorite. If you mark it as favorite, it will show up in here and you can access it. Right now it has one example, but we're actively working on adding a few more examples. For example, random forest, and for some of them, put them in the knowledge store so that people can have access to them. But right now you can have access to it in the examples projects.
Your code workbook has to be saved inside of a project. And so anything that's inside that project is going to be accessible to other members of that project, which is fairly locked down. Other people will need to have join the same DUR that you use to establish that project, or you'll be joining someone else's existing DUR to get into their project folder.
Yeah, as you can see, the code workbook I just created is saved in, this is an example project I created for this orientation, but it would be saved in here. But by default, it is not possible to move resources between projects. And by resources, I mean a data set or a code workbook or a contour analysis. Usually you have to stay within the scope of your project. And obviously within the scope of your project, we can import some of the commonly used tables, such as the domain tables, whether it's LDS or de-identified, and the concept set tables and the concept tables.
So somebody asked about what about things outside the project? And I think the answer is there is no such thing as outside of a project in N3C. Every thing needs to be done within a project folder.
There was a question earlier that I think we should touch on, which is commenting on identifying when a comorbidity was first known to be present, in particular, what the comorbidity known to be present prior to COVID diagnosis. So could you guys talk a little bit about sort of the dates and working with them?
Yeah, so the condition tables, which have all the like codes or diagnosis that you'd be associated with comorbidities, they all are associated with a date. So you'd want to do something where you find where the COVID diagnoses are for everyone, and then do a join on the comorbidity table and remove stuff that happened during that visit or after that visit for each person. These kind of joins get a little more complicated, but experience with SQL and joining and all that stuff will help you get there. If you're really stuck with, like, I want to ask this question, I think Slack is probably the best place to ask those specific questions, like, hey guys, I'm trying to do this query and I can't figure it out. And usually somebody can jump in probably the either the analytics channel or the methods channel would be a good place to ask those kind of questions for specific, like, how would I set up my joins to ask this question? There's a question, can I share my code workbook between different projects? The answer is you cannot share the code workbook itself, but you can turn all of the ingredients inside that workbook into a template, put it in the knowledge store, and then anyone else can grab all the code into a fresh workbook from wherever. So there's sort of like a vetting process where the only thing that transfers from project to project has to go through the knowledge store and is going to be the code, not necessarily the data. There's a final question here too. What is good practice to generate a merged table with different longitudinal events? I might have answered some of that with respect to the conditions, but really like some of these questions will just be more and more complicated joins and filters and select group by pivots, etc. I'm not sure exactly what, if Feifan, if you could be more specific or let us know if we've generally answered that question. Can you create a new branch? Yes. You can branch inside a code workbook and work in that, and then you can merge back to master. Now,
Yeah.
You want to talk about that? I was going to say the one limitation is you can't pull from a master into a branch right now. So it doesn't have full Git capabilities that you might be expecting.
Let me show it real quick, Richard. So can you guys see my screen? So in this workbook here, you're on the master branch, but we can create a new branch. Let's call it SL, new branch. And so that's a different branch that I created. I can make changes to it and work independently of the master branch. And I can merge it back to the master if I have changes that I want to merge back to the master's branch here. But this is basically how it works.
So there's a question about uploading. And I think the simple answer is that if the data is small, put it in a Fusion sheet. And you can just like copy a reasonably sized piece of data and put it in a Fusion sheet. And that'll be accessible to your code workbooks. Larger pieces of data, if you're like trying to import a whole study, I think there's a whole nother branch, and I would ask for help before attempting to do that alone.
Yeah, I would add to that, Richard. It depends on the data, obviously. So the uploading external data is disabled by default, and it goes through an approval process that is described on the homepage on the support section. But if it's things like I want to upload a code set or mapping or concepts mapping, then yeah, one way is what we described: upload it, just copy paste it on a Fusion sheet, and then create a data set out of it. Or if it becomes too large, you can ask for Palantir's help, and we'll upload it for you guys.
Someone asked to add the code for the cohort characterization in the knowledge store. The answer is most of it is already there right now. Thanks mostly to Mark Bissell helping to convert all of our stuff to templates. Most of it is available now, so you can select the best visit. There's severity calculations, pulling out all the lab data that we used. It's not 100% done, but the core pieces are actually in the knowledge store. I think Saad's about to.
Yeah, so this is an example. This one is a severity scores patients, logic and data sets. So you can explore it in here.
And there's even, did you show? Maybe you shouldn't show, but there are example workbooks using both the level 3 and level 2 data.
Yeah, I wasn't sure because it's LDS and
I wouldn't click on it here, but
but if you do have access to LDS or the unidentified, you should be able to see it. So sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we should probably wrap it up to our last couple of questions. Are there any last notes, Richard or Saad, that you wanted to mention along the way as you're thinking about things?
I think just that last question that came in here was if the code came from the cohort paper. Saad, you can click which, can you show the originating research project? Down on the left.
Yeah. Originating research, sorry.
But there's a filter on the left. Yep, exactly.
Yes. So these are all the templates that come from the cohort paper projects. So you can explore them. And I see a last question, I guess, in code workbook documentation, are there example codes in R or is it only in Python? So there are there are examples of R. There are more examples in Python at this point, unfortunately, but this is one of the reasons we created that example workbook with some R examples. So you can look in both in the documentation, and if you don't find what you need, you can look at the example workbook. And if you have any issue, just reach out to us or file an issue and we'll try to help you with your code.
Thank you so much, Saad. And thank you very much, Richard, as well.